This like Andrew Wilson debate tactic is so many
Andrew
of
Wilson
you.
debate
Yes.
tactic?
This debate.
Now you're cutting me off. So why don't
Okay, do you
why
wanna
don't you
keep-
stop and just relax for a second?
Yeah, this was bad.
To a
You
great
almost
start.
called me the R word earlier.
The
so-
R word?
I-
What? You're the one that has it written
Okay.
down on her paper
Yeah,
here. So
people, you have notes.
these are
But-
outlines for your worldview.
They're different.
Let me finish.
Jesus Christ.
Just shut your mouth and let me finish.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Truth and Tradition. Today, I'm reacting to a debate on the Whatever podcast between Orthodox Christian Dr. David Patrick Harry and recent Jubilee guest and social media influencer, Zina. I had Zina on this podcast as a guest after her debate with Jordan Peterson regarding God's existence. On that video, one of my viewers suggested that I watch Zina's appearance on the Whatever podcast, where she debates the existence of free will. If you are at all familiar with the Whatever podcast, they tend to produce content that is controversial and not necessarily geared toward in-depth discussion.
Hey, stop using logic and reason. Stop that.
I'm not here to judge this format, to each his own. However, this particular episode has had zero pushback, despite the debate containing blatant lies and deception. Oh, and a few angered outbursts.
What
It was a
evidence do you have
preference
for human agency?
I never said it was a preference.
What
Let me
agency?
finish.
So I examined the claims, researched the topic, and went through hours of personal philosophizing so all of you can have a better, more intriguing take on the topic. For this debate, in one corner we have Zina, who holds to determinism, a view that sees the world in terms of cause and effect. All events are the result of previous causes, ultimately outside the control of any single person, and thus there is no free will. And in the other corner, we have Dr. David Patrick Harry, who argues in favor of free will's existence, that is, libertarian free will. He claims that choices can be uncaused, resulting ultimately from the person's soul, given to them by God. Our choices can be uncaused decisions that come from the person's God-given ability to use rationality. I'm sure all of you have well-warranted thoughts and opinions about this topic, but as always, I ask that you approach this with an open mind. Keep your comments kind and charitable, and after considering both perspectives, let me know your thoughts. Without further ado, let's get into it.
To begin, obviously, I'm going to be affirming the existence of free will, and determinism is self-refuting ideology. Every paradigm has a metaphysics, an epistemology, and an ethics. Two of those legs, determinism is already going to lose. If all beliefs are conditioned based on, nature versus nurture, they're neurological, your brain's determined, you're conditioned by social patterns, well, then all knowledge claims are then beliefs. And if that's the case, then you can actually not make a universal knowledge claim. The same thing as if you were debating an argument for relativism. Claiming that relativism, that there is no truth as a truth statement, is counterfactual and contradicts itself, can't go anywhere. That's a self-defeating argument, especially within a debate that is premised on logic, reason, and all these different things.
Okay, this is a great point by Patrick. You can think of it like this. Determinists often believe that there is no free will because of materialism. Materialists believe there is nothing beyond the physical world. So living organisms are entirely the product of nature and nurture. This means that you have no free will because based on the biology you receive, your nature, you will always react and change in the same way according to the experiences you have, your nurture. This includes your desires and personality, because if these were entirely material, then they must follow the physical law of causation, which states that every event must have a prior cause. So say your decision to eat chocolate ice cream over vanilla is ultimately determined by prior events out of your control that made you favor chocolate ice cream over the vanilla ice cream. This idea is known as materialistic determinism. And here in Patrick's opening statement, he's pointing out that materialism, which depends on evolution, is self-defeating. Why? Well, this is because evolution selects for survivability and not logical truth. The animals that desire to survive and reproduce are the ones that will do so, whereas the ones that stand around trying to understand if maybe there's a lion behind that bush, or maybe it's just my friend. I wonder. Well, they're more likely to be eaten. Thus, based on materialistic evolution, the laws of logic are ultimately based on survivability, not the truth of reality. In this case, 2 plus 2 might not actually equal 4. We might be forced by evolution to think this is true because believing it is somehow useful to our survival. So, any logical argument made under this worldview is suspect because the worldview has undermined the ability to make logical claims. Now, it is important to stress that determinism does not require materialism to be true, although most materialists are also some type of determinist. Determinists don't argue that they don't think free will exists, but rather that it cannot exist under any worldview. So, whether there is a spiritual realm or not, determinists argue that free will does not exist, period. Patrick's point is a great point to refute materialism. However, he is debating the existence of free will, not materialism. Now, you might be asking, what is determinism then, if not the product of materialism? Well, determinism in a broad sense is simply the belief that everything is either caused or random. If it's random, then there is no free will because randomness implies a lack of choice. But if it's caused, it's either forcefully caused onto the being or it's caused by the being itself who wanted to do said thing. If you're forced to do something like sneeze, achoo, there is clearly no free will. But if you do something because you want to, then the question becomes, do you choose your wants? We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. But first, do you like coffee? I sure do. In fact, most days, coffee is the very thing that provides me with the energy to get these episodes out to all of you. If you enjoy these podcasts and would like to support the channel, you can send me a tip at buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition. Also linked in the description down below. Here you can send me a one-time or reoccurring gift if you really love me. Let's keep things PG. You can also send me a custom message, which is greatly appreciated. That's buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition or the link in the description down below. Cheers. I encourage y'all to think deeply about this because I think we can understand we truly can't control our wants. But the short answer to that is definitely no. We have wants, but we do not control what we want, because if we controlled what we wanted, we would just be maximally happy. If we just had to switch what we wanted, then there would be no not being happy or pleased with our situation because we would just change what we want to match our situation. So if we were to be put in prison, all we'd have to do is say, okay, well now I want to be in prison, and we'd be happy. But that's not how the world works. So clearly we can't control our wants. Thus, since we can't control our wants, there is no free will. God in a spiritual realm can still exist with this type of determinism. It is then on the libertarian, though, to explain how free will can fit into this idea, which I personally think is possible, but I'll get to that later.
For just a quick opening syllogism, and so anybody watching, if this opening statement maybe feels like it's a little bit over your head, that's all right. We'll get into the nitty-gritty as the debate moves forward. But if moral responsibility, rational deliberation, and love are real, which the majority of people presume that they are, and determinism, compatibilism, or Skinnerian behaviorism render them illusions, then determinism, compatibilism, or behaviorism are self-refuting worldviews because they depend on the very realities that they deny.
Ooh, okay. This syllogism makes no sense. I think I see what he's trying to get at, but the words he uses here are just far too ambiguous, and the conclusion has to be explained as to why it follows from the premises. That's just a bad syllogism right there. Not to mention, he's trying to prove two different ideas in the same syllogism. For those who are unfamiliar, syllogisms are logical statements. They generally have two premises and a conclusion that naturally follows from the premises. You can think of it sort of like a math equation. If the conclusion does not naturally follow from the two premises, it's as if the two sides of the equation don't balance out. A classic example written by the creator of syllogisms himself, Aristotle, goes like this. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. You see how the conclusion naturally follows from the two premises? If premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then the conclusion must also be true. There is no explaining why the conclusion is true with a because statement. The conclusion just follows. Question. Do you use TikTok? Well, if you don't, you should, because you can now find Truth and Tradition on TikTok. I'll be posting all of my shorts and going live on TikTok, so give it a follow and share it with anyone you think might enjoy the content. That's truth_tradition on TikTok. You don't want to miss it, and I'll see you right over there. This argument works for people who agree with you already, but for those who disagree, they will either fail to understand what you are saying because it's too vague and incoherent, or they will conclude it to be invalid because they want to interpret it in a way that does not deal with their worldview. In this first premise, it says if moral responsibility and rational deliberation are real. My question then is, what do you mean by real?
What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe?
In the definition of determinism, you include compatibilists.
And determinism, compatibilism, or Skinnerian behaviorism.
The compatibilist redefines free will to fit a deterministic perspective. According to compatibilists, free will is action made in accordance with a person's desire. Sure, they believe the desire to be caused by things outside that person's control. So ultimately, they couldn't have done anything differently. They couldn't have chosen otherwise. But the mere fact that you are choosing to do something according to what you want, that, according to the compatibilist, is free will. So with this in mind, moral responsibility can still be real for the compatibilist, since the person made a moral choice in accordance with their desire. But they still reject your definition of free will, which includes the ability to choose differently. Now, this syllogism is difficult to understand, but I think what he is trying to say is something along these lines. I would first try and split up the syllogism into two separate syllogisms because you're trying to prove two separate phenomena in one argument. The first one would be about moral responsibility, and it requires the capacity to have acted differently. Premise 1, moral responsibility requires the capacity to have acted differently. Premise 2, determinism entails that no one can act differently from how they are physically or metaphysically determined to act. Therefore, moral responsibility is impossible under determinism. This syllogism clarifies what is being critiqued and how the logical critique follows on the basis of morality. As long as you agree to the first two premises, the conclusion must follow. Now, for rationality, it would go something like this. Premise 1, if determinism is true, then all reasoning and logic are determined by prior states. Premise 2, if all reasoning and logic are determined by prior states, then they are not guaranteed to be valid or reliable. Therefore, if determinism is true, we cannot trust the reasoning used to argue for determinism. I hope this helps clarify the argument Patrick is making, because I honestly think they are very solid arguments. It was just being presented in a way that was difficult to grasp. Now, this rationality critique, the second one that I did, is not just a critique on materialistic determinism, but a critique on the philosophical argument of determinism itself. It's an important distinction. And this is exactly what Dr. Harry is referring to when he says, under determinism, all knowledge are beliefs.
If determinism is true, no one can actually be held morally responsible for anything. If determinism is true, then all knowledge are beliefs. Therefore, determinism itself is a belief. Amongst all beliefs are equal. And on that basis, determinism is not rationally justified. The phenomenological argument against determinism is that no determinist actually lives as if determinism is real. They live as if they are free. Argument from counterfactual possibility, all decisions presuppose modal freedom. So when evaluating alternative possibilities, determinists rely on what could have been. For example, if they go to court, yet in their worldview, there is never a what could have been because everything's already determined. And then I assume what's going to pop up is that determinists like to use a neuroscientific argument that's really built upon Benjamin Libet's findings. It's really from the 1980s, and the field of neuroscience has actually moved beyond this. So it's a minority opinion, the idea that neuroscience has actually proven that your brain is determined or your thoughts are determined. This is not the universal opinion of the field. It's actually a minority opinion. And so Libet himself actually says that his research did not prove this, and therefore insinuating that the brain is already determined before the action occurs. And so I referenced everybody to go look up David Schroeder's 2012 article. It's titled RP as Neural Noise, RP meaning resting potential. And so the majority of the field believes that whatever was happening is just neural noise, and actually the premise that neuroscience has highlighted that everything is deterministic, that is not a majority consensus. Creativity and novelty. So if you're a determinist, you're going to have to reject human agency in regards to poetry, art, invention, moral heroism. These things break away from any sort of predictive causal mechanism that they would argue for. The last one is the problem of infinite regress. So if you go back to Aristotle, the unmoved mover, this was something that was dealt with in classical Greek philosophy. And so obviously, I'm coming at it as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and so we believe in the Imago Dei, Genesis 1:26. And because of that, I myself am also, in a sense, an unmoved mover, that I can be an uncaused cause within myself as a person utilizing my free will.
Okay. One thing I'll add to that final point is that it is a reference to the problem of causation. What Dr. Harry is saying is that if everything has a cause, as determinists claim, then this leaves an infinite sequence of causes that requires an uncaused cause to begin it all. This is what he means by the problem of infinite regress. However, determinists don't have an issue saying that God or something else is the initial cause, just as Patrick here suggests. This still works under the philosophical argument. However, materialistic determinism rejects God, so that would have to respond to this claim in some other ways. But at that point, we are basically arguing for and against the Kalam cosmological argument, not free will. Again, though, this argument refutes materialism, but not necessarily determinism. This is the case for several of his 7 objections. In this section, he also mentions neuroscience, and I found this to be the most problematic out of his entire argument. This is where most of the deception and misinformation for Dr. Harry's argument lies. First off, there's no paper by a David Schroeder named RP as Neural Noise. I tried searching all over for it and I found nothing. The paper I think he is referring to, though, is this 2012 paper by Aaron Schruger titled An Accumulator Model for Spontaneous Neural Activity Prior to Self-Initiated Movement. Bit of a mouthful. This paper does critique the Libet study, but not in the way that Patrick presents. Let me break it down, but first I'll go through the Libet study quickly so you'll see exactly what I mean. In 1983, Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment to measure the timing of a person's conscious experience with brain activity. He wanted to know how closely linked the conscious mind was to the measured brain activity for movement. This brain activity for movement is called readiness potential, not resting potential, as Patrick says. In the Libet study, he hooked up participants to an EEG machine and asked them to flex their wrist whenever they felt like doing so. He asked them to observe a moving clock as well at the same time, so the participants could tell when they precisely became aware of the desire to flex their wrist. And then he measured when they did the action of flexing their wrist, along with when it came inside the EEG machine. Now, Libet expected the conscious awareness to either precede or coincide with the timing of the readiness potential. But he was surprised to find out that the readiness potential came before the person's conscious awareness, not after. Libet ran this experiment several times, and the average timing for things went like so. First, the readiness potential started to amp up 550 milliseconds prior to the movement. Then 350 milliseconds later, just 200 milliseconds before the movement, the person becomes aware of their decision to move their wrist. He names this W time, or willingness time. Then at T0, or time 0, the person makes the movement and flexes their wrist. The aftermath of the experiment had many claiming that there is no free will, and everyone is controlled by their unconscious self. While his work does point in favor of this conclusion, Lebet himself saw issues with his own experiment, and many have done similar tests since then and show that this conclusion is not firmly founded. Lebet, like any good scientist, talks about two issues with his test. First, he says that there may be a veto power where a person can choose to go against the movement they were going to do. He even tried measuring this supposed veto power, but that experiment has been critiqued because he asked participants to basically pretend to flex their wrist, but end up not doing it. The issue in this being that the participant is being asked to intend to do something while ultimately knowing they will not be doing said thing. The second issue he highlights is the idea that doing something simple, like flexing your wrist, is nothing like the process of thinking deeply about a hard decision. Perhaps the decision to move your wrist is so simple that your body takes the lead before you're consciously aware. But to say this kind of process applies to your decision to propose to someone or to accept a new job offer, that seems fishy. It seems like these kinds of decisions would be more in our control, so we should not apply the outcome of the Lebet study to these more complex decisions. It is these 2 points that Aaron Schruger's follow-up study set out to answer. Now, Schruger did a similar experiment to Lebet and found that a veto power does exist and that there is a time following that moment where the action will always happen. A point of no return, where no matter what, by this point in the decision process, if the person has not vetoed it, the person will always flex their wrist. Schruger deems this a threshold where once the amplitude of the readiness potential reaches a certain amount, the action will always happen. Now, the timing of the veto power, or the free won't, as others have called it to be, is heavily contested. Some suggest this can only happen before a person is consciously aware of the decision in their mind, in which the choice to not move is still an unconsciously decided choice. But other studies like Schruger's suggest that this choice not to move can happen after the person becomes consciously aware. This is all difficult to know because the timing of the person's conscious awareness is subjective. It's based on the person marking down when they feel some sort of urge to flex their hand. When we are talking about milliseconds, that is a difficult thing to be precise about. So this point of veto power is widely debated, and Schruger himself acknowledges this. This is where things get crazy. The other thing that Schruger found is that the readiness potential might not be an unconscious decision to move. The spark in brain activity might be more like activity that is just always happening, always going on in the background, but sparks up and down at certain points, and once it reaches a certain point, causes the movement. In his model, the stochastic accumulator, this measures the readiness potential brain activity. And here he points out the readiness potential as ongoing, spontaneous fluctuations of neural activity. Basically, the readiness potential is always ramping up and down in amplitude, but movement occurs when the amplitude reaches a certain point. This movement is more based on reaching that amplitude than the conscious awareness. So the conclusion is that the decision to flex your wrist is less about an unconscious decision triggering a conscious decision, which triggers a movement. No. It's just random brain activity that reaches a certain threshold, and that causes the movement. The flexing of the wrist is randomly done, not consciously chosen. So Patrick's paper that supposedly proves his point about free will actually shows that we have no choice when making simple movements. It's just random. This is such a bad argument, but it works because people don't have time to read 10+ page academic papers. It's honestly embarrassing. I want to believe you, but when you straight up lie to prove your point, it makes it hard to respect you in the debate. Neuroscience has not come to any clear consensus about free will. And even if it showed that we have willpower over our unconscious choices, this would still fail to prove free will. It would just prove emergentism. that our conscious awareness does affect our choices. The question of whether our life experiences and biology affect our perspective and conscious desires is still untouched. And if those remain caused, as physics seems to suggest, then there's still no free will. There's still no choosing otherwise.
Into the 20th century, multiple turns have occurred in various fields that have essentially rendered determinism as nonsense. First one is quantum mechanics. So the Heisenberg uncertainty principle contradicts Laplacian determinism. Laplace's demon is a common sort of thought experiment determinists use. Well, again, quantum mechanics itself has already refuted that that's the universe that we live in. So in regards to physics, physics has already refuted determinism. In regards to mathematics, chaos theory in the 1960s also refuted determinism because it demonstrated that in an attempt to actually show that deterministic systems are completely determined, it demonstrated that actually they're unpredictable and there is no deterministic full system that we've discovered yet. Number 3 is mathematical logic. So Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems demonstrates that there are limits to what can be proven, and no complex system can prove its own consistency. That would also be the case for determinism. You presuppose determinism to prove determinism. That is a contradiction. The cognitive revolution, linguistics, Noam Chomsky has already refuted the idea that we are determined. Language acquisition, so that was another turn in the 20th century, again, refuting determinism. And then number 5, philosophy of mind. So epiphenominalism is typically the way that determinists would argue for their philosophy of mind, but emergentism is now the dominant thesis. And then the self-referential collapse. This is essentially the logical basis that all of this debate's going to hinge on, is that one cannot rationally affirm determinism since belief in determinism is due to prior states, then it too is a non-rational belief that cannot be rationally or universally justified. So that is my opening statement.
All right. Well, looks like we have a few more red herrings. Now, these things, they're big words, big academic ideas, which do critique the idea of determinism in that it is entirely predictable. But this isn't necessarily what determinists argue for. Determinism is a broad word that just means you don't believe in free will. And as defined in his own words, it's not just that you don't believe in free will, it's that you don't believe even in free will according to compatibilism. The only type of free will that he's willing to accept is the libertarian sense of free will, which is the ability to have chosen otherwise. My question to you is, if something's random, could you have chosen otherwise? Is there any sense in which there's a choice? No, there's not. There's no choice, there's no will, there's just randomness. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, chaos theory, Gödel's incompleteness theorem are all evidence of randomness and incompleteness in the universe and nothing more. Now, he also mentions the idea of emergentism versus epiphenominalism in the philosophy of mind. I'd like to know Patrick's source about the opinions of philosophy of mind folks and where they stand on this issue, because I could not find anything about this. However, even if most philosophy of mind experts are emergentists, this does not mean they are advocates of free will. In fact, I would argue the opposite, since according to the 2020 Philippaper survey, 62.89% of philosophy of mind philosophers are compatibilists and deny traditional free will. Only 15.58% accept free will in the traditional sense. And for those who are wondering, what the heck is emergentism then, if not another word for determinism? I'm glad you asked. Broadly, emergentism is the idea that new things arise when systems become complex. Think of a water molecule. The molecule H2O is not wet in and of itself, nor can it make you wet by itself. However, when we bring together many water molecules, eventually it becomes liquid water, and you can become wet when you swim in it. We can apply this same idea to conscious rationality. Conscious rationality does not exist until particles are put together in a specific way for it to emerge as a property of the brain. Now, contrary to what you might be thinking, both emergentism and epiphenominalism can hold to this being the case. They differ in the idea that conscious rationality can actually impact anything that happens. Think of a sports game. Epiphenomenalists view conscious rationality like a sports commentator. The commentator talks about what is happening in the game. They may even get emotional about what is happening, but nothing that the commentator says will affect how the game is played. In the same way, when you think about a decision, that thinking is ultimately not part of the choice you make. Your body makes the choice, and your rationality just comments about what is going on. Now, emergentism is the opposite of this. Emergentism believes that conscious rationality is more like a coach. The coach makes plays and encourages his team and has an impact in how the game is played. It's not the only impact, but it is an impact. This ultimately has nothing to do with free will, though, because in weak emergentism, which I assume is the main consensus that Patrick is talking about, conscious rationality is still a causal thing. The conscious rationality still has the ability to influence action, but is still caused by what came before it. So there is no free will.
I just wanted to clear up like a couple things about my framework and like what I mean when I say that I'm a determinist. I don't mean that like everything in the universe must have some like specified cause, that everything is predictable. Instead, that in any circumstance, any event is either caused or uncaused. And when we look at the self specifically, we're going to see that like when we look at any like thought that we have, any want that we have, and thus any action that we have is going to result in some kind of external cause, right? So essentially what I'm saying is that free will is the ability to have done differently or to have chosen differently in any certain instance. So it's either that any event is caused or uncaused. And that cause, when we push back the chain of causality, is going to result in something that is either like your brain or your nurture.
All right, so Zina responds to many of Patrick's claims by explaining that randomness is not the same as free will, but that everything is either caused or uncaused. This is a great response. She also clearly defines free will in the deterministic and libertarian sense as the ability to have done differently. This is an excellent clarification. The main critique here is that Zina has not organized her thought process, and her opening statement is focused entirely on responding to Dr. Harry's claims instead of making her own claims. However, this is a rhetorical critique rather than a critique on her ideas, so it's not that big of an issue. What makes me sad is people have a difficult time seeing past a person's filler words, and because of that, they will conclude that the person doesn't have a good point. I get what she is saying though, and it is similar to my logical statement I had at the beginning about everything being caused or randomly determined.
People who kind of study just like the way that we have evolved as human beings have kind of found that this idea of free will is a feeling that we have. It's a sense that comes kind of like after the fact when it comes to like action, where we feel like we have some agency because we have developed the ability to create a conjunction between this idea of like the past, the present, and the future. So, as we evolved, the organisms that were able to say, hold on, wait a minute, yesterday I did this and today I want to do that. They were able to strive for different goals, achieve more. And that's kind of just going to be like reminiscent of like intelligence. Your thoughts prompt your actions, but your thoughts have some cause that are either due to some type of biology or some type of nurture. This is kind of like the whole field of psychology, the nature and nurture debate. And then, there are many different angles we can take this from. It's pretty simple. So, yeah.
So Zina takes a scientific approach to determinism rather than a philosophical one. This is difficult because it forces the burden of proof onto scientific inquiry rather than sticking to the strong philosophical critique of the impossibility of free will, regardless of your worldview. She takes the philosophical approach later in the debate, but she instead decides to take the scientific approach here, which is not as strong. Also, she mentions that evolutionary biologists argue in favor of epiphenominalism.
Free will is a feeling that we have. It's a sense that comes kind of like after the fact when it comes to like action.
This might not be exactly what she meant, but her phrasing made it seem this way. I think this is why Patrick brings up epiphenominalism as soon as the debate starts, since it's hard to defend this standpoint. However, I would be curious as to what these scientific studies were, where you get this information, and what they actually were concluding. But overall, they were short and sweet opening statements, so let's get on to the debate.
So you're arguing that the only thing that exists is materialism, right?
Like the material world?
The material world, right?
I don't think I have to posit that to make my claim. Not necessarily. I'm simply
Well, I'm asking, what is your claim? Are you a materialist?
I don't think I have to, like, I haven't completely refined like my ideas on kind of like materialism versus idealism. I would probably be materialist, but I don't think I have to, 'cause that entails this conversation or it's necessary for the conversation.
This is true. Materialism is not necessary for determinism, but it's a fair critique. And Zina should have stated more precisely what she is arguing in favor of rather than discussing her indecisiveness about materialism. But it's tough to be in situations like this, so I feel for her.
Well, the idea is if you're assuming materialism or any sort of epiphenomenal understanding of free will as some type of experience that's not rooted in actual consciousness or human agency, it's a circular argument because you're appealing to materialism, your brain, to come up with the universal truth statement that everything is determined.
Here, Dr. Harry seems to suggest that epiphenomenalism is the same as determinism, which is not the case. These are two different ideas. One does entail the other, but they are not the same thing. It is important to distinguish them because the opposite of epiphenomenalism is emergentism. But emergentism is not the opposite of determinism. To his point about determinism being self-defeating, though, this is a valid point. But from here, he then has to explain how free will could exist philosophically, which he never ends up doing. He just says that free will is given to us by God and that it's this mysterious thing that allows you to have uncaused choices. Given the law of causation, this makes no sense. So he has some explaining to do. How can free will exist if physics says that everything is caused? This entails that even rationality, our deciding between different choices, must also be caused, and ultimately that cause does not come from ourselves, but is outside of our control. Patrick never offers a solution to this. Now back to his point, the craziest thing is that philosophy does lead us to concluding that philosophy cannot be validated. This doesn't mean that it isn't valid, like Patrick wants to suggest, but that we can't know if it's valid or not, since our only way of validating it is through logic itself. A.E. Taylor sums up the problem well when he says, each of us, if we are to push the determinist theory to its logical conclusion, thinks what he does think, and that is all there is to be said on the matter. Which of us thinks truly is a question which, even if it has an intelligible meaning, is and entirely must remain without an answer.
So let's get into epistemology. How do you, so are you believe in objective truth?
That there is objective truth?
Yes.
I would say that like we can't make claims onto reality as it absolutely is. I think that like our kind of faculties...
Isn't that what you're doing right now?
Hold on.
Isn't that what you're doing?
We make assumptions every day, right? That like the world around us exists. So we can do things like science, right? And psychology.
And that's
we
induction,
assume,
yep.
Yeah, it's an assumption, right? That everyone like acts upon today. We don't really know what the world exists outside, what it looks like outside of a human body. We know that, like, for example, ants don't see the same things as us, neither do like insects, like even the color schemes that we see are different than animals. So we know that like objectively, the world does not look the way that we see it, right? But we assume that it exists to interact with it for ease, etc. That's how scientists come to conclusions. There are baseline assumptions, right, to engage with any of these.
Now, this is a great distinction by Zina, and Patrick has to accept this, even with his belief in God. We, with our limited minds, cannot understand reality as it truly is. We have eyes that interpret rays of light, so we can see shapes and colors. We have ears that interpret sound waves into different pitches. These are not objectively how things are. We can't perceive them as they actually are, but have different strategies for interpreting them. Her example with the ant was a great example. Ants have 2 compound eyes and 3 simple eyes. They perceive the same ultimate reality as us, but in a totally different way. So the conclusions they make about reality will be different, but just as valid. We most likely miss things in reality because we have limited faculties. So we must recognize that reality is different than how we perceive it to be, and that we may not be able to describe how ultimate reality actually is. This is similar to how Christians and other believers comprehend God. we make analogies about God to describe who he is. We can't totally comprehend God. I mean, this is clear in the Bible. Isaiah 55, 8-9 says, "For all my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Romans 11:33 says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out." Job 26:36. "How great is God beyond our understanding. The number of his years is past finding out." No matter what your worldview, you believe that ultimate reality is not fully received by humans, and any attempt to describe said reality will miss the mark. Laugh all you want. You believe the same thing. And actually, you have to accept this for free will to exist. Philosophically, there is only one way for free will to exist, and it is by accepting that we don't perceive reality objectively. Otherwise, we are governed by the law of causation, and there is no free will.
Yeah, but science is also appealing to the laws of logic, the law of identity, and all these different things. I asked you a simple question.
But they all lie on assumptions, yeah.
No, they're not assumptions. So you don't believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4?
We rely on the...
Does 2 plus 2 equal 4?
We rely on the assumption.
Does 2 plus 2 equal 4?
Can I answer your question? Because
yeah.
Relying on the assumption that everything around us exists and things of that nature, yeah, I completely agree that there is some truth that we can find. But you must agree upon reality as the basis, right?
So... regarding objective truth, I want to just hammer down what exactly your epistemology is.
My epistemology?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that in general, I don't think we can say that something is objectively true because I don't think we can truly see reality as it truly is, because we already know that our faculties of experience, our senses are set in some way that we know other animals already don't have. Right. So we can only trust the human experience and what patterns that we recognize across the human mind, but we don't exactly know what it could look like outside of a human faculty of perception. Do you understand what that means? Yeah, which means that you just refuted yourself to you're making universal claims right now. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, so this debate,
you're making universal claims.
We're not having, okay.
You just said free will doesn't exist. Now you're cutting me off. So why don't you stop and just relax for a second? Because what you did is you just fundamentally contradicted yourself by saying that all we do is we have experiences of our environment. We really can't make universal truth claims. And then you're coming here to actually make a universal truth claim by saying free will doesn't exist, or free will is just an experience, or free will is epiphenomenal. And therefore, you've already undermined your own epistemological foundation and leads to the inability to have any sort of rational inquiry.
Oh boy, that got heated. Dr. Harry is right in saying that Zina was making objective truth claims, but these claims were with the caveat that, given our subjective experience of reality, blank seems to be the case about reality. As I said before, everyone has to do this. This is what René Descartes is referring to when he said, "I think, therefore I am." This comes from his 1637 book, Discourse on Method, where he does an exercise of doubting everything he possibly can to see if there's anything left that he cannot doubt. This exercise led Descartes to concluding that the only thing he could not doubt is his own existence, because in order for him to doubt that means there is some sort of doubter somewhere doubting. This doubter must in some form exist in order for him to be doubting actively, and thus he concludes, "I think, therefore I am." Or maybe more precisely put, "I am thinking, and therefore I currently am." At the end of the day, this is the only thing we can know with certainty. And anything else, no matter how much evidence we have in favor of it, is an assumption at its base. This is what Zina means when she says, given the assumption that things exist, because ultimately that might not be the case. When we make claims about how reality is, we have to do so with a number of assumptions in mind. In philosophy, these are called axioms, things that people must accept in order to have any sort of discussion. I don't know with absolute certainty that language exists, that words have meaning, or even if you guys exist. I hope you do. Please don't click away. But theoretically, it could all be an illusion. But we assume these axioms in order to have a conversation, in order to just live our daily life. And this is exactly what Zina is getting at. The two of them proceed with this point for a long time. So I'll skip ahead to when they actually get back to discussing free will.
Yeah. So my view is that, which you haven't attacked whatsoever, is that wants, right, are not coming from this individual. Instead, we can like find some type of cause, right, that extends outside the person, that terminates outside the person, right? Do you have an argument against that?
Yeah, actually, multiple neuroscience experiments has demonstrated that, again, dealing with Libet and dealing with these resting potentials has shown that people can actually prevent a series of, or a cascade effect from the actions occurring, which demonstrates a sense of agency. This is why you are not in step with the contemporary neuroscience. You're not in step in contemporary psychology. You referred to psychology earlier. Those fields do not uphold a deterministic worldview. No, they do not.
So no one's
no,
saying...
they do not.
Look, y'all can see that Patrick is already willing to lie to prove his point. His neuroscience argument should have been that studies regarding free will are inconclusive and have several issues. Not that they prove you can choose to override your bodily decisions. Oh, and this is not the consensus of neuroscientists. I don't know where he's getting this point at all. I looked up surveys about where neuroscientists lie on this topic, and I could not find any. ChatGPT suggested a few studies for me to check out, suggesting the contrary, that most lean determinist or compatibilist, but in terms of libertarian free will, that is a minority opinion. Now, these studies either don't exist or don't contain surveys, as ChatGPT said, so take that with a grain of salt. I would wager that most neuroscientists lean toward determinism or compatibilism and not libertarian free will, because that is how the majority of other experts lean. In fact, at 44:42 in the debate, there was a super chat that mentioned a survey of philosophers who mostly lean compatibilist. According to this survey, 59.16% lean compatibilist, 11.21% strict determinist, and only 18.83% for libertarian free will. Now, I personally hate appeals to authority like this. It's okay to point out, but if this is your main argument, that's just sad. I also hate that I have to bring this survey up, since people will see that only 18.83% of philosophy experts lean libertarian, but that fails to recognize the solid arguments for their position. This small number of libertarians have thought deeply about this issue and came to the conclusion that libertarian free will is true. And yet, many of you will see the survey and say they are wrong because they aren't part of the majority consensus. This is why appeals to authority just suck overall. However, more importantly, this doesn't even answer ZINA'S question. The ability to override an impulse fails to respond to the overall idea of determinism. If everything is caused, as determinism suggests, even that choice to override an impulse would also be caused by something out of your control. Your experiences and learning and other biological factors would all be at work to deny said impulse. Patrick, for some reason, cannot separate epiphenominalism from determinism. I think he might just not understand that these are two distinct things. I don't know. Now, I think this might get to another interesting issue with determinism. Notice my response from earlier in the video. If everything is caused, as determinism suggests, even that choice to override an impulse would also be caused by something out of your control. Is that testable? I mean, is there any way I can prove that the choice to override an impulse was determined by prior life experiences? No, I don't think so. It follows deterministic thought, but in no way can we test that this theory is true. This is because whenever we try to test it, determinism just pushes the problem back and says, well, that other thing behind it all, that right there, that's determinism. This could go on forever. So we have another issue with determinism. It seems to be untestable. So what I would have said to ZINA is, okay, sure, all of this can be theoretically determined, but at what point do we just say, this theory is untestable? How can you show me scientifically that this philosophical basis, this philosophical principle is not just a infinite regressing thing, but instead can actually be tested in some capacity? That is where neuroscience can step in and potentially bring your argument just a little bit more power.
So I'm saying that even if someone does rise against what we call their biology or their socialization, the result is, or the reason always comes from they're either one or the other, the biology or the social.
So why is the abuse bad?
Because I personally don't think that it's okay to.
So it's just a personal belief. It's just your preference that abuse is bad.
I think that. So are we going to switch to a morality debate, or do you want to stay on the
It's
topic
all the same thing.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No,
It all, again, there's only three legs
No,
to
it's not.
worldviews.
This is
okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, then go into morality.
No, I don't want to go into morality.
Yeah,
We're talking about
we
free
are.
will.
So Zina says here that you don't need to talk about morality in a free will debate. And that's technically true. Morality has nothing to do with whether free will exists. And I can see why she would be frustrated because she's trying to explain her point. She's trying to get Dr. Harry to respond to her, and he just seems to decide to change the subject randomly. That's pretty annoying. However, morality is usually discussed in free will debates because the phenomena of free will affects how morality plays out in the world. The main reason we discuss free will, in fact, is not because we care about whether we have free will or not in a deterministic sense. It's actually usually because we want to protect morality. This is why it actually does matter to discuss it. Not because it affects free will, but because it's an implication of free will. Now, Dr. Harry also brought it up in his opening statement, so it's very important to discuss for that reason as well. Now, I restated Patrick's main argument syllogism as two separate syllogisms. His syllogism about morality is as follows. Premise 1, moral responsibility requires the capacity to have acted differently. Premise 2, determinism entails that no one can act differently from how they are physically or metaphysically determined to act. And conclusion, therefore, moral responsibility is impossible under determinism. Moral responsibility seems to be impossible for determinism. So the question then becomes, can we actually have morality? Can we actually have anything that is right and wrong in determinism if there's no moral responsibility? Now, that's a different distinction. Determinists can say things are morally right and wrong, since they don't have to hold to materialism and subjective morality. The question of whether people can be held morally responsible, though, is a different question. Determinists would view people in the same way they'd view, say, a wildfire. If a fire burns down a home and we see that as bad, we would say that the fire is responsible for burning down the house. However, you would not go up to the fire and say, shame on you for doing this. So we would not say that the fire is morally responsible. It's responsible, but not morally responsible. Determinists would view people in this way. Sticking to the fire analogy, the determinist would then ask what caused the fire. You might get answers like, the electrical wiring was poorly done. There were maybe too many things plugged into an outlet, or the parents accidentally left the lighter out and their toddler was playing with it. These are all possible causes for the wildfire to burn down the house. And we can do the same thing with people. What caused this person to commit a crime? Maybe they were in poverty. Maybe they were in an abusive environment. Maybe they have a mental illness that wasn't being treated. Maybe it's all of those things at once. Determinism does not have people who are morally responsible for what they do, but they are responsible for their actions, and we can deal with the root of the problem instead of just punishing the person. Deterministic morality is about helping assess the root of the problem and providing the care and resources so criminals can develop and become a more contributing member of society. That, or in extreme cases, containing individuals who are threats to both themselves and others. Determinism creates a morality that is not based on punishment or retribution, but rather in containing and rehabilitating people. It's actually an approach that's very similar to Jesus' sentiment on the cross in Luke 23:34, when he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." We can even see that data regarding incarceration shows that prisons built for rehabilitating the inmates have better results than those simply built to punish the inmates. This graph comes from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it shows that the amount of people in prison, adjusting for population size, is far higher in countries where prisons are meant to punish inmates rather than ones like in Norway meant to rehabilitate inmates. It also shows that people are more likely to get a job when released from prison, that people who never had a job before going into prison are more likely to participate in job skill training programs while in prison, And recidivism rates, that is the likelihood a prisoner will recommit a crime, are 22% lower in countries with rehabilitation-type prisons. We even have evidence that shows the justice system might improve by adopting a deterministic view. This is sort of a weird phenomena, and several sources have reported that this is truly the case. Apparently, the number one factor that affects a judge's choice to sentence someone or not sentence them is based on whether they ate prior to dealing out the sentence. Crazy. The National Library of Medicine's study, titled Judicial Breakfast as an External Factor in Judicial Decision-Making in Courts, says, indeed, people would appreciate it if judges made their rulings based on written laws and rational decisions. However, the reality is that their decision is influenced by irrelevant factors, such as their breakfast and mood. I guess the next time you're sent to court, you might want to bring a sandwich.
That's a 10.
Considering the idea that people do not have free will might help make for better prisons and a fairer justice system. This is what the data suggests.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So I feel like I haven't been able to. What causes people to act the way that they do?
It's a series of factors. They have their own human agency. Again,
Can you
nurture
explain
and
that? Any proof or evidence of that?
Will you let me freaking talk? I mean, I say one sentence and you're already cutting me
Let
off.
him finish if you can. Go ahead.
So again, there's multiple factors that contribute to the way that people exist in the world. Human agency, again, nature and nurture, all these things are included. It's not one or the other. And the idea that we have to just restrict our defense to just one particular one, that's ridiculous. That's not how the world works. It's both and.
Okay.
There's multiple factors that contribute that shape to a human person, their parents, trauma, environment, genetics, all these things are included, but that doesn't deny that people have human agency and free will. And so if free will doesn't exist, you cannot make any moral claim because nobody is morally responsible. Nobody is ethically responsible. And this would be true for the history of injustices. This would be true for the patriarchy.
So I just want to keep...
Can I finish a thought? That would be true for patriarchy. That would be true for SA. That would be true for reparations. That would be true for slavery. All these things entail that there is some type of moral arbiter that differentiates between good and bad.
Okay.
Your worldview does not allow that to even occur.
What is this human agency? Like, can you just define it for me? I'm clueless. What is that?
Yeah, for me as a Christian, it's being made in the image of God, Genesis 1:26.
All right, so every human has this human agency. It means you're made in the image of God.
Correct.
And God gives you this human agency, correct?
Being made in the image of God, yes.
All right, so if every person gets this human agency they're given at birth, essentially, right? So what makes some people's human agency act differently than other people's?
We just said there's a whole contributing list of factors.
All right, so the other factors you labeled had to do with nature and nurture, the biology and the environment. You talked about
those
parents.
are included.
Right. So if these two things that we agreed already are fixed, right, our biology.
They're not fixed.
Yes, they are. You don't control the biology that you inherit.
Your environment changes.
Do you control the biology that you inherit?
Well, biology. Biology is fixed.
Okay,
your environment is not fixed because you can change environments.
So
that was a dumb argument.
Guys,
that was a dumb argument.
Let each other finish. Go ahead, finish.
That was a dumb argument because biology, but we're talking about nature and nurture.
Yeah.
And so environments can actually change.
Okay. So your biology is fixed, right? So what would make someone want to change their environment?
They want new scenery.
Why would they want new scenery?
You tell me. You have to ask them.
No.
You have to ask them.
Okay, right. So if we were look at the reason why someone has a preference for new scenery, we can look at things like just like what they're like kind of exposed to at a young age. For example, like if they grew up around beaches, maybe they would like beaches. Or it could just be like the things that they've been shown like through TV, media, etc. All the stimuli. However, at this young age where all these core beliefs are being like kind of taught to you and instilled in you, you don't control any of that, right? Your preferences are made at this like a younger age. We see this idea of core beliefs come up a lot in psychology where like your deepest beliefs about society and yourself, who you are, this illusion of free will, and the self comes about a lot of times when you're younger, right? So even now when you have the agency now to change environment, which you don't really have that agency when you're like 2 years old, let's say you're like 20 and you can move, that preference that we're talking about to change scenery or to fly to Paris comes from determined, right, like circumstances. That's what we're saying. In any given event, we keep asking why you wanted this thing or why you did this thing. It is either coming from like some internal, like some nurture, right? Something like that has been like experienced or from someone's biology. That's what we're saying.
This is very well put. If we can't control our biology, then the biological things that determine what we do are not free. If we can't control our environment, our nurture, then events and circumstances that happen to us are also not in our control. From there, the conclusion is that all desires and inclinations inside a person come from nature and nurture, and thus are not controlled, so there is no free will. So how can human agency fit into that? What is human agency, and how can it emerge without being ultimately caused by nature or nurture? There is an answer to this, and I keep alluding to it, but first, I want to see what Dr. Harry has to say.
There's been multiple experiments. This is, again, getting back to David Schurger's 2012 article, RP as Neural Noise, have demonstrated that when these neurological effects reach the cascade point, that a determinist would say, okay, now they have to do the action. We have multiple experiments to show that people can choose not to. And the fact that they can choose not to do it demonstrates they have some type of agency against the deterministic framework of the brain and neurological processes that you would argue.
Determinists are not saying that you are bound by like your inherited biology.
It depends on who you're talking about. And you're making a generalized claim. Okay, so don't say determinists then, because actually
I would
many
assume that when you
determinists
come
do.
into this debate and you give me like some type of like refutation, it's like tailored to me and like,
well,
like
you have
right? So
you've made
some general like blanket like statement and said it replies to like determinists.
Well, that just demonstrates human agency. You asked me to demonstrate human agency. Multiple neuroscience arguments do that.
Okay, so once again, he fails to respond to ZINA'S question. As I said before, this neuroscience study does not say anything against the philosophical argument of determinism. It only shows that there's randomness to certain human decisions, which is clearly not free will. Now, in terms of actually responding to ZINA, this is how a libertarian free will advocate would respond. Human agency, similar to what Patrick said in his opening statement, must be an uncaused phenomena, something that starts within the agent themselves. Determinism says this is impossible, no matter if you believe in God or a metaphysical world or not. However, this assumes that the law of causation is not just a law to describe our perception of reality, but that it truly governs how reality actually is. This is why perception of objective truth versus ultimate objective truth is important to discuss in this debate. If our perception of reality shows that everything is caused, this does not necessarily mean that in reality everything truly is caused. This is the assumption of determinism. Thus, if this is not the case, and I think we have reason to think this, we can have rational deliberation that comes from a person and is uncaused. Suppose you're playing a game of chess and you want to win the game. This want is what drives each decision that you make inside the game. And we know you don't have control of your wants. So what is driving you is ultimately not free. That's fair. However, each decision on their own is not merely driven by the want to win, but uses rationality to make the decision in accordance with the want. So back to the chess analogy, on my next move, I can either move a knight or a bishop. Both of these pieces are the same value in chess, so it's the same risk to move either one. Let's say I reason that if I move the knight, it helps me get closer to my want to win the game because it forces my opponent to lose their rook, which is a high value piece. Now, I could do that, or I can reason to move the bishop, which puts my opponent's king in check. So they have to move the king into a spot that is more dangerous for them. Both decisions help me, the player, get closer to what I want, which is to win the game. And I can use reason, which is uncaused and comes from the person, to decide to move the knight or the bishop. You can't say I moved the bishop over the knight because I wanted to move that over the other. This is not an emotionally driven desire. The desire is the same for both choices, winning the game. What is different is the reason I create to choose one over the other. In a view of the laws of physics, according to Hume, this rationality is not caused, but an uncaused phenomena that arose out of the person in accordance with what they wanted. Now, this assumes that the law of causation is descriptive and not a perfectly governing law. And I think we have reason to think this because causation depends on time. There is no event causing another event unless we have a time when the cause happens and a later time when the effect happens. So if the law of causation requires time, We then ask, is time fundamental? Does time truly govern reality, or might it too be a description of reality given our limited perceptions? When we think of Einstein's theory of relativity, we see that time is relative based on the speed at which an object is moving. Thus, time is not fixed, and everyone is living in their own perception of time. This theory starts to put into question whether time is truly a governing law of ultimate reality, or if it's merely a description of reality. Since time and thus causation are both relative, then things can be uncaused, making it possible for an agent to form rationality out of themselves.
Okay, so you understand that God is outside space and time, right?
Yep.
And so the difference is actually watching the choices that we've already made is not the same thing as making us make the choice.
He doesn't have to watch
When you
you.
go to a restaurant and there's only certain items on the menu, are you determined to choose something, or is actually there's a set of opportunities to make choice?
It's not opportunities. It's not
not
choice.
opportunities.
No.
So when you tell me
once again,
how
so when
you
we talk
choose
about
when you go to
omniscience, right? When we talk about omniscience, right? If God does not need to be seeing everything in linear time to know what will always happen, right? If
Right.
you just look at just like the story of like anyone in the Bible, like Noah from Noah's Ark, he already knew everything that was going to happen, and thus Noah could not have acted outside of God's knowledge.
No, he could. He could have chose not to listen to God. That's the whole point of being a Christian, is
Noah-
that we're aligning our will with God's will.
God
That's the
knew-
whole point of being a
God
Christian.
knew that he would not act in accordance with God, correct? God knew that Noah would not act in accordance with God.
God, as outside space and time, knew that Noah would make the choice, but Noah
Yes.
making the choice is not dependent. God didn't force him to make the choice.
Okay.
Again,
so
those are two. That's a
once again,
category. That's a logical
I didn't even
category
get to
error.
make the argument
That's a
yet.
category error.
I didn't make the error that you're trying to.
That's a category. You said that
haven't been able to speak
omniscience
yet.
demands determinism.
So again, if God knew, he doesn't have to be looking at this from like a linear perspective of time, but if he always knew, he's omnipotent, omnipresent, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If he always knew what Noah could do, by definition, Noah could not do what God did not know he would do, aka God knew there was some path that everyone was going to have. God knew what their future would hold, what their present would hold, what their past would hold, whatever. There's some future that existed for Noah, and he could not have acted out of accordance with it because God already knew it.
But God knowing does not entail causation of him causing the person to choose it.
I'm saying that he couldn't have acted differently. I do think there is an argument for causation.
No,
but
again,
regardless,
that's a
he could not have
category
acted
error because
differently.
God is out.
Can you do something that God does not know you will do?
He's outside space and time, so he's already looking at history as a finished, completed thing. He knows the choices I'm going to make before I've made them, but that doesn't mean that I did not have free will to make my choices.
Can you do something that God does not know you will do?
No, because God's already outside space and time. But again, that doesn't necessarily that's not causal necessity.
Okay, well, this section was definitely confusing. Zina here makes two claims. First is that if an omniscient God exists, that is a God that knows everything, then things are determined. Now, here is the distinction. It is not necessarily that God chooses or causes what happens, but rather that he knows everything. And so as long as what he knows isn't incorrect, then the fact he knows all events means that the events are determined. Not necessarily determined by God, but determined beforehand in some sense, and thus there is no free will. It's easy to think that this is modal reasoning, right? Because God's knowledge of how a future event will play out does not make that event necessary for every possible world. But given the fact that he knows it will happen despite every possible world, makes it to be the only option actually possible. Omniscience entails that no one can make choices outside of God's foreknowledge. Here's a syllogism. Premise 1. If God is omniscient, then he infallibly knows all future events. Premise 2. If God infallibly knows all future events, then no event can occur differently than how he knows it will occur. Conclusion. Therefore, no event can occur different from what God knows. However, this fails to recognize that God's omniscience might be knowledge of all possible future events in every possible world. He might not know which possibility will play out, in which omniscience is still intact, but just defined differently. And in that case, free will can exist, and there can be a libertarian sense of free will of choosing otherwise. This form of omniscience would not be stuck to a specific possible world, but instead it would allow for possibility within his foreknowledge of every possible world. ZINA'S second point is about God being outside time rather than omniscience. You can think of what this would look like in terms of a wooden fence. Let's say time is like looking through your neighbor's backyard through a tiny little slit in a wooden fence. Let's say then a cat walks by and you see the cat through the slit in the fence. First, you see its head, then its body, and finally its tail. You might think of this in terms of the head happened, which caused the body, and then the body caused the tail. Now, in this analogy, you'll miss the fact that it's one intact cat, since you are looking at it through the slit in the fence. This is similar to time. If we were God and we were outside of time, it would be like seeing the entire pattern of the cat rather than just parts of the cat at a time through the slit of the now. If God sees the pattern of reality, not just time as we perceive it, then it isn't foreknowledge, but simply knowledge of what is. Now, it's hard to understand what really things would be like to be truly like outside of time. I think a pattern is probably the best example, but given the analogy, it may just suggest a different form of determinism and not necessarily libertarian free will. If God's knowledge about our future event is due to him observing the pattern of reality, then the future events must play out the same way always. Otherwise, the pattern would be broken in some way. We would see the tail or the nose or the head in the wrong spot. Or there might even be holes in the cat, holes in the fabric, the pattern of reality. It's not a perfect analogy, but it might work in that way in which there's still determinism, even if God is outside of time. Sufficient to say it's pretty messy, and we still don't have evidence for this specifically being the case. So to each his own.
The agency thing, I do still just have like a really big issue with it, with this knowing that there is some set future, and then also saying that we can act out of accordance with it seems to be incoherent to me.
Well, it's a category. I mean, my argument, that'd just be a category error in regards to God. And so that's the whole point of sin. So we can choose right and wrong decisions. Some of us choose bad decisions, and those consequences follow. And God, Christ, being the incarnate God, has a perfect heart. That heart is the heart that all of us are going to be judged upon. And my agency to choose right or wrong does not diminish God's omniscience. And God's omniscience does not diminish my ability to make a free will choice right here, right now. So again, predictability is not proof of determinism. And it's just probability under limited circumstances is essentially what you're, and that's where my point with the restaurant earlier, it's like, just because there's limited opportunities to choose on a particular menu doesn't mean that I'm determined for any one particular meal that I choose.
And that's an interesting point made by Patrick right there. God being outside of time means he is able to know all events in history. This is similar to our ability to know past events in history. We know what happened in the past, but the knowledge does not make what we know to have happened. We didn't cause that because we know it. This gets to the difference between fatalism and determinism. Fatalism is the idea that the future is already written, that God or some source has caused something to play out in a certain way, and you have no choice in the matter. This is not what ZINA is arguing for. She's arguing for determinism, not fatalism. God knows the future, yes, but the future is not necessarily caused by God. He just knows it. We can still make choices that are our own in a compatibilist sense. However, you can't make choices outside what God knows will happen. In other words, you cannot choose differently than what God knows you will choose. You might be the one choosing it, but you can't choose otherwise. Now, he does bring up an interesting idea of eating at a restaurant and choosing between multiple choices on the menu. I don't know how this fits his analogy, unless he is arguing for a probabilistic future rather than a deterministic one. If the future is probabilistic and God is outside of time observing all possible future events and past events relative to us, then free will can exist in the libertarian or deterministic sense. You may choose otherwise within the realm of possible worlds that God knows about. this would be a much stronger argument. So if this is what he means, I can get along with that. However, the way he talks about his view of time in regards to God throughout most of this debate seems to be different to this conclusion. I don't know. Well, guys, that is going to end today's video. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe. This video took me over a month to research and put together, so I would really, really appreciate that. If you like this video, then consider checking out this one on your screen. In it, I spoke with Zina about a different debate that she had with Dr. Jordan Peterson. As always, you can check out more information about me on Instagram, TikTok, and here on YouTube at truth_tradition. I'll see you guys around.